A millionaire is humiliated by a tour guide, and his mother hires her to be his fiancée. Before we get into the story, tell us in the comments, what's the most embarrassing public moment you've ever witnessed? And at the end, don't forget to rate the story from 0 to 10. Enjoy. Julian Davenport believed history was something you owned, not something you experienced. It was a collection of artifacts to be bought, companies with century-old names to be acquired, and stories to be neatly summarized in the glossy pages of his company's annual report. As the 30-year-old CEO of Davenport Holdings, a global acquisitions firm, he didn't have time for the messy, inefficient details of the past. He was a man focused entirely on the future, a future he intended to purchase. This was why he was currently enduring what he considered a special form of torture, a historical walking tour of Rome. He was here to finalize a multi-billion-dollar deal to acquire a historic Italian luxury brand, and his mother, Beatrice Davenport, had insisted he absorb the local culture. Beatrice was the matriarch of the family, a woman of formidable elegance and an iron will wrapped in Chanel. What Beatrice insisted upon usually happened. And if you look to your left, a bright, passionate voice chirped, cutting through Julian's internal monologue about interest rates. You will see the Arch of Constantine, a magnificent testament to victory. Of course, Constantine's victory was a bit like a hostile takeover in today's terms. He came in, rebranded the whole empire, and put his logo on everything. Some things never change, eh? Julian looked up, mildly irritated. Their tour guide was a young woman named Isabella Rossi. She was a whirlwind of expressive hands, with a cascade of dark, curly hair escaping from a loose bun, and eyes that sparkled with a fiery intelligence. She wasn't just reciting facts, she was telling a story, weaving in modern analogies and witty asides that had the rest of the small tour group captivated. Julian found it deeply unprofessional. Beatrice, however, was enchanted. She hung on Isabella's every word, laughing at her jokes and nodding thoughtfully at her insights. Their final stop was the Colosseum. Isabella stood before the magnificent ruin, her voice filled with a genuine reverence that even Julian couldn't ignore. This place, she said, was the heart of Rome, a place of incredible spectacle and incredible brutality. It reminds us that every great empire has a foundation built on things we'd rather not look at too closely. As she spoke, Julian's phone buzzed. It was his lead negotiator. He answered it, turning his back on the group and starting to speak in the low, clipped tones of a man closing a deal. "No, the offer is final. Tell them we walk if they don't accept the terms by 5 p.m., he said, his voice a sharp contrast to the historical awe of the moment. He was so engrossed in his call that he didn't notice the tour group had started to move. He took a step back, still talking, and collided squarely with Isabella, knocking a heavy leather-bound book from her hands. The book landed with a sickening thud in a large, muddy puddle left by a recent rain shower. The call was forgotten. Julian looked down at the book, now soaking in the brown water, then at Isabella's face. Her fiery, passionate expression had been replaced by one of pure, unadulterated horror. "My book," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's just a book," Julian said dismissively, already pulling out his wallet. "Here, I'll pay for it. How much?" That was the wrong thing to say. The horror in her eyes vanished, replaced by a flash of righteous fury. "Pay for it?" she repeated, her voice rising. "Pay for it? Do you think everything in this world has a price tag? Do you think you can just throw money at a problem and make it go away?" The rest of the tour group and dozens of other tourists stopped to watch. "That wasn't just a book, you arrogant, Gucci-wearing barbarian," she continued, her voice echoing slightly in the ancient plaza. "That was a first-edition copy of Gibbon's The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It was my grandfather's. He read it to me when I was a little girl. It was the only thing I have left of him. And you just drowned it in a puddle while closing a deal on your phone in front of the one place on earth that should teach you a little humility." Julian stood frozen, completely stunned. No one had spoken to him like that in his entire adult life. He was the CEO of Davenport Holdings. People didn't yell at him, they deferred to him. Now, there's no need to cause a scene. He started, reverting to his usual condescending tone. A scene? She laughed, a wild, incredulous sound. You think this is a scene? I'll show you a scene. She pointed a finger directly at his chest. You walk through the city like you own it, but you see nothing. You stand in front of 2,000 years of history, and all you can think about is your next acquisition. You are the modern embodiment of the very thing that made this empire fall. A man with so much power and so little soul that you've forgotten what it means to be human. The crowd was now a full-blown audience. People were filming on their phones. Julian felt his face burn with a humiliation so intense it was dizzying. I am so sorry for your loss, a quiet, elegant voice said from the side. Beatrice Davenport had stepped forward. She looked from her stunned, silent son to the furious, passionate tour guide. Then she did the last thing anyone expected. She started to smile. But I must thank you, Beatrice said to Isabella, her eyes twinkling with amusement and something else, a deep, profound interest. Isabella blinked, the wind taken out of her sails. Thank me? For what? For doing in 5 minutes what I have been trying to do for 30 years, Beatrice said, her gaze flicking to her son. You've rendered him completely speechless. It's a miracle. She then turned to Julian. Darling, she said, her voice full of false sympathy. It appears you have a problem. You have deeply offended this young woman. And since our deal with the Italian brand depends heavily on our family's reputation for respecting local culture, you must make amends. Mother, this is ridiculous, Julian finally managed to say. On the contrary, Beatrice said, her smile widening. It's a perfect opportunity. Miss Rossi, she said, turning back to Isabella, my son is in desperate need of a cultural education. And as it happens, he is also in need of a fiancée for the upcoming gala season to appease our more traditional business partners. Julian's and Isabella's jaws dropped in unison. Mother, you can't be serious, Julian hissed. I have never been more serious in my life, Beatrice declared, her voice ringing with authority. Miss Rossi, I will pay you a sum that will not only replace your grandfather's book 100 times over, but will also allow you to fund that small, independent historical society you've been trying to start for the past 2 years. Isabella stared at her, completely dumbfounded. How do you know about that? Darling, I'm a Davenport, Beatrice said with a wave of her hand. I make it my business to know things. You will pretend to be Julian's fiancée for the next 6 months. You will attend a few galas, smile for the cameras, and most importantly, you will spend at least 10 hours a week teaching my son about art, history, and the revolutionary concept of not checking his stock portfolio during a tour of the Sistine Chapel. In return, your historical society gets its funding. What do you say? Isabella looked from the formidable Beatrice to the mortified Julian, and then at the crowd of tourists who were now openly eating popcorn. Her life had just turned into a bizarre, high-stakes romantic comedy. She thought of her struggling historical society, a passion project she poured all her spare time and money into. She thought of the chance to teach this arrogant, soulless man a lesson he would never forget. All right, she said, a slow, mischievous smile spreading across her face. I accept, but I have one condition. Name it, Beatrice said, clearly delighted. He, Isabella said, pointing at Julian, has to come on my Rome for Beginners tour, the one I give to college freshmen, and he has to take notes. Beatrice let out a peal of delighted laughter. Oh, this is going to be even more fun than I thought, she declared. Julian, darling, it seems your cultural re-education is about to begin. Try not to fail the pop quiz. Julian Davenport had negotiated hostile takeovers, faced down congressional committees, and navigated the treacherous waters of international finance without ever breaking a sweat. But sitting in the back of his own Rolls-Royce, next to a fiery tour guide who now held a contractual obligation to be his fiancée, he felt a level of profound dread he hadn't experienced since his first day of boarding school. Isabella Rossi, for her part, was a whirlwind of contained energy. She had retrieved her soggy, ruined book from the puddle with the care of a paramedic handling a fallen soldier. It now sat on her lap, wrapped in a silk scarf Beatrice had produced out of thin air. She wasn't looking at the ancient Roman scenery passing by the window. She was looking at him, her dark eyes a mixture of triumph, suspicion, and a daunting level of intellectual curiosity. So she began, breaking the tense silence. Fiancé, this is a new and interesting development in my career path. Does this role come with health insurance? You will be compensated generously, as my mother stated, Julian said, his voice stiff. My assistant will draft the contract tonight. It will be comprehensive. Oh, I'm sure it will be, she said, a playful smirk touching her lips. I can't wait to read the clauses. The fiancé shall not under any circumstances quote historical trivia during shareholder meetings. Or perhaps the fiancé agrees to refrain from calling the CEO a Gucci-wearing barbarian in public. He felt a flush creep up his neck. Your performance was unnecessarily theatrical. Unnecessarily theatrical? She repeated, her voice rising with a familiar fire. My dear temporary fiancé, you destroyed a priceless family heirloom and then tried to pay for it like you were settling a bar tab. What you saw was not theater. It was a deeply authentic expression of my desire to throw you into the Tiber River. Beatrice, sitting in the opposite seat, let out a delicate, amused chuckle. Oh, I like her, Julian. She has spirit. You could use a little more of that. I have plenty of spirit, Julian muttered, sinking lower in his seat. The contract arrived at Isabella's small, charmingly cluttered apartment near Trastevere that evening via a stern-looking man who introduced himself as Julian's lawyer. It was, as Julian had promised, comprehensive. A 40-page document that detailed everything from her required public appearances to a strict social media policy. She read the entire thing, a cup of strong espresso in hand, and then took out a red pen. She spent the next hour making corrections. She crossed out a clause requiring her to have her wardrobe approved by a corporate stylist, and wrote in the margin, "My personal style is non-negotiable. It is the visual representation of my intellectual integrity." She added a new clause stipulating that for every hour spent at a boring corporate gala, Julian would be required to spend an equal amount of time at a dusty, poorly lit museum of her choosing. She also added an addendum, which she titled the Barnaby Addendum, requiring Julian to make a significant donation to the city's stray cat sanctuary. She sent the heavily annotated contract back with the lawyer, who looked at her edits with a mixture of horror and disbelief. The next morning, her phone rang. It was Julian. "The Barnaby Addendum?" he asked, his voice laced with tired resignation. "Barnaby was a stray cat who lived near my grandfather's apartment," she explained matter-of-factly. "He was a very discerning judge of character. I feel it's what he would have wanted." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Fine," he finally sighed. "My legal team is having a collective meltdown, but fine, the cats will get their donation. Are we done?" "Not even close," she chirped. "Our first cultural re-education session is today, 2 p.m. sharp. Meet me at the Borghese Gallery, and for heaven's sake, try to wear something that doesn't look like you're about to foreclose on a Renaissance painter." He hung up without saying goodbye. Julian arrived at the Borghese Gallery at precisely 2 p.m., wearing a beautifully tailored but slightly more casual linen suit. He found Isabella standing in front of Bernini's sculpture of Apollo and Daphne, her expression one of deep, reverent concentration. "All right," he said, checking his watch. "Let's get this over with. We have an hour before my call with the Tokyo office." Isabella didn't even look at him. "Look at her," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the marble figure of Daphne. "Look at the exact moment she is saved from Apollo by being transformed into a tree. Look at the terror and the relief in her eyes. Look how her fingers are already sprouting into leaves, her toes taking root in the earth." Julian looked. He saw a statue, a very well-carved, admittedly impressive statue. "It's remarkable craftsmanship," he said, trying to sound knowledgeable. "Craftsmanship?" She finally turned to face him, her eyes wide with a kind of horrified pity. "That's like looking at the Mona Lisa and saying, 'Nice brushwork.' This isn't about craftsmanship, Julian. This is about a story. A story of a woman so desperate to escape a powerful man that she would rather become a tree than submit to him. It's about the violence of unwanted pursuit and the tragedy of a transformation that saves her life but robs her of her humanity. Can you feel that?" He looked back at the statue, trying to see what she saw. He saw marble. He saw technique. He didn't feel anything. "I feel that it's a valuable asset that has been well preserved," he said honestly. Isabella sighed, a deep, theatrical sound. Oh, we have so much work to do. Your soul is a barren wasteland of pragmatism. For the next hour, she led him through the gallery, not as a tour guide, but as a passionate, demanding professor. She didn't just show him paintings, she forced him to engage with them. She made him stand in front of Caravaggio's David with the head of Goliath, and describe the look in Goliath's eyes. It's self-recognition, he found himself saying, surprised by his own insight. Caravaggio painted his own face on Goliath. He's seeing his own monstrosity in the moment of his defeat. Exactly, Isabella exclaimed, her face lighting up. You see, you're not a complete emotional desert. There's at least a small, struggling cactus in there somewhere. He found himself against all odds, enjoying it. She had a way of seeing the world, a way of finding the hidden narratives in everything, that was utterly foreign and completely intoxicating. She was a human cipher, and he was beginning to enjoy the process of being decoded. Their session was interrupted by the buzz of his phone. It was his mother. "Darling," Beatrice's voice trilled. "I have wonderful news. I've scheduled your first official appearance as an engaged couple. The Contessa's annual charity ball. It's this Saturday, the most important event of the Roman social season. You and your lovely, fiery fiancé will be the guests of honor." Julian felt a familiar wave of dread. "Mother, that's too soon. We're not ready." "Nonsense. The best way to sell a story is to tell it to the most influential audience possible. Wear your blue suit, Julian. It brings out the color of your disillusionment. Ciao." She hung up. He turned to Isabella, who had overheard the conversation. "The Contessa's ball," she said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. "Oh, this is going to be a disaster." "We don't have to go," he said, a part of him hoping she'd give him an out. "Are you kidding?" she said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "I wouldn't miss it for the world. I've read about the Contessa's parties in history books. They're legendary. It's time to see if the modern version lives up to the hype." She looked him up and down. "But we are going to need to do something about your wardrobe. You can't meet the Roman aristocracy dressed like a hedge fund manager on his lunch break." "What's wrong with how I'm dressed?" he asked, genuinely offended. "Nothing," she said, patting his arm. "If you're trying to blend in with a very expensive, very well-tailored wall. But we're not blending in, Julian. We're making a statement." The next 3 days were a whirlwind of preparations that felt more like a hostile takeover of Julian's life than planning for a party. Isabella vetoed the corporate stylist his mother had sent, declaring her an enemy of personal expression. Instead, she dragged him to a small, hidden atelier in a back alley, run by an elderly Italian designer named Signor Vittori, who had apparently dressed movie stars and royalty in the 1960s. "Signor Vittori," Isabella had announced, "this man needs help. He has a good soul, but it is trapped in a prison of navy blue wool." Signor Vittori had looked Julian over with a critical eye, tutted disapprovingly, and then, with a flurry of measuring tape and Italian pronouncements, had set to work. Isabella, meanwhile, had found her own dress in a vintage shop. It was a stunning emerald green gown from the 1950s that looked like it had been made for her. When she tried it on for him in the back of the shop, he had been rendered completely, utterly speechless, a state that was becoming increasingly common in her presence. The night of the ball, as they stood at the entrance to a magnificent Roman palazzo, Julian felt a nervousness he couldn't explain. He was wearing a custom-made tuxedo by Signor Vittori that was, he had to admit, a work of art. And Isabella, on his arm, was a vision. The green dress shimmered under the chandeliers, and she wore her grandfather's only other surviving heirloom, a delicate pair of silver earrings. "Ready to face the lions?" she whispered, sensing his tension. "As long as you're with me," he replied, surprised by his own sincerity. Beatrice was waiting for them just inside, looking regal and triumphant. "Ah, my darlings," she said, kissing the air on both sides of their faces. "You look magnificent. Everyone is dying to meet the woman who has finally captured my son's cold, calculating heart." "Mother, please," Julian muttered. "Don't worry," Isabella whispered to him. "I've got this." And she did. She moved through the crowd of Italian aristocrats and European billionaires with an easy, unpretentious grace. She spoke fluent Italian, charming the old Contessa by discussing the architectural history of her palazzo. She debated Renaissance art with a famous collector. She even got a notoriously grumpy German industrialist to laugh by telling him a self-deprecating story about her first disastrous attempt to make pasta. Julian watched her, mesmerized. She wasn't pretending to be someone else. She was just being herself, and her authentic, intelligent charm was more powerful than any carefully constructed socialite persona. The evening was going surprisingly well until he appeared. Marco Bellini. He was a handsome, charismatic Italian businessman and, as Julian quickly learned, Isabella's ex-boyfriend. "Bella!" Marco exclaimed, his face lighting up as he saw her. He strode over and kissed her on both cheeks with a familiarity that made Julian's jaw clench. "I heard you were back in Rome, but I never imagined I would see you here. And looking more beautiful than ever." "Marco," Isabella said, her smile a little tight, "it's good to see you. This is my fiancé, Julian Davenport." Marco looked Julian up and down, a competitive glint in his eye. "Davenport," he said, shaking his hand with a little too much force. "The American. I've heard of your firm. You buy old companies." "We preserve legacies," Julian corrected, his voice like ice. The two men stood facing each other, a silent, alpha-male battle being waged over the champagne flutes. "So," Marco said, turning his charm back on Isabella. "A fiancé. I'm surprised. I always thought you were too smart to be tied down." "It seems I found someone who can keep up with me," she replied smoothly, slipping her arm through Julian's. But Marco was not easily deterred. For the rest of the evening, he was a constant presence, cutting in on their conversations, telling old inside jokes with Isabella, and generally reminding Julian that he was an outsider in her world. The final straw came on the dance floor. A slow waltz began, and Julian was about to lead Isabella onto the floor when Marco appeared. "May I have this dance?" he asked, not looking at Julian, but directly at Isabella. For old time's sake. Before Julian could object, Isabella, with a look of cool politeness, said, "Of course, Marco. Just one." Julian stood on the edge of the dance floor, a glass of scotch in his hand, and watched as his fiancée danced with her handsome, charming ex-boyfriend. He watched them laugh, he watched them talk, he watched Marco whisper something in her ear that made her blush. And he felt a surge of raw, unfamiliar, and incredibly potent emotion. It was jealousy, pure, unadulterated, and completely illogical. He knew it was a fake engagement. He knew he had no real claim on her. But in that moment, watching her in the arms of another man, the only thing he knew was that he wanted to punch Marco Bellini squarely in his perfectly chiseled jaw. He drained his scotch in one gulp, set the glass down with a sharp click, and started walking towards them. He didn't have a plan. He was running purely on instinct, and his instinct was telling him that this fake engagement was about to get very, very real. Julian strode onto the dance floor with the focused, predatory grace of a shark moving through open water. The other dancing couples, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, seemed to part for him instinctively. He reached Isabella and Marco just as the waltz was ending. He didn't say a word. He simply placed a firm hand on Marco's shoulder, a clear, unmistakable gesture of ownership. Marco turned, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Davenport, I believe we were having a private dance." "The dance is over," Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet. He looked at Isabella, his blue eyes blazing with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "Our car is waiting." Isabella, caught between amusement and a genuine flicker of alarm, allowed herself to be led away. She could feel the stares of the entire Roman aristocracy on her back. As they walked out, she glanced over her shoulder and saw Marco standing alone on the dance floor, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. Beatrice, watching from her table, took a slow, satisfied sip of her champagne. Her plan was proceeding perfectly. The ride back to the hotel was a symphony of tense silence. Julian stared straight ahead, his jaw so tight Isabella was afraid he might crack a tooth. She, on the other hand, was trying very hard not to smile. "Well," she finally said, unable to resist. "That was quite a performance, very alpha male protecting his territory. I didn't know you had it in you." "He was touching you," Julian gritted out, his knuckles white on the leather steering wheel. "It was a waltz, Julian, not a wrestling match," she countered, though a thrill went through her at the raw possessiveness in his voice. "And he's an old friend. There was nothing to it." "He was looking at you like you were the last slice of tiramisu on earth," he shot back. "And he kept whispering in your ear." "What was he saying?" Isabella's smile faded slightly. She turned to look out the window. "He was apologizing," she said quietly. "Apologizing for what?" "For being a fool," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For letting me go. He said it was the biggest mistake of his life." The silence in the car became heavier, but it was a different kind of silence now, filled not with anger, but with a new, more complex tension. When they arrived at the hotel, he walked her to the door of her suite. They stood in the quiet, carpeted hallway, the unspoken feelings from the dance floor and the car ride swirling between them. "You're not just a tour guide, are you?" he said, the question more of a statement. "Marco Bellini doesn't date just a tour guide. His family is one of the oldest in Italy." Isabella leaned against her door, crossing her arms. "And your mother is Beatrice Davenport. You think she would hire just a tour guide to be her son's fiancée?" She shook her head. "You Davenports are all the same, so focused on the labels, you forget to read the story." "Then tell me the story," he said, his voice low and earnest. "Who are you, Isabella?" She looked at him for a long, searching moment. She saw the genuine curiosity in his eyes, the frustration, the jealousy, and underneath it all, a vulnerability that mirrored her own. She sighed, a quiet surrender. "My grandfather wasn't just a man who loved books," she began, her voice soft with memory. "He was Professor Antonio Rossi, one of Italy's most renowned historians. My family, we didn't have money, but we had a legacy of knowledge. I grew up in libraries, not palaces. I learned to read ancient Latin before I learned to ride a bike." Julian listened, captivated. "I got a full scholarship to the Sorbonne in Paris," she continued. "That's where I met Marco. He was charming, exciting. He was my first love. But his family never approved. I was the poor scholar, the girl with ink on her fingers instead of diamonds. They wanted him to marry for status, for a name, and in the end, he chose them. He chose his legacy over me." She gave a small, bitter smile. "It seems to be a common story among men of a certain class." The barb hit its mark. Julian felt a pang of shame, thinking of his own grandfather. "After the heartbreak," she went on, "I came back to Rome. I didn't want to go back to the academic world. It felt hollow. So I started my own business. I used my knowledge not to write papers for stuffy journals, but to share the stories of this city with people who actually wanted to hear them. I built it from nothing. It's small, but it's mine. It's honest." He looked at her, at the fierce pride in her eyes, and he felt a wave of admiration so profound it almost knocked him off his feet. He had seen her as a chaotic, fiery tour guide. He hadn't realized he was dealing with a world-class scholar, a self-made entrepreneur, and a woman who had rebuilt her own life from the ashes of a broken heart. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Because I wanted you to see me," she said simply. "Not my degree, not my family's name, not the story of my ex-boyfriend. Just me, the woman who yelled at you in front of the Colosseum. Was that enough?" He stepped closer, the space between them shrinking until he could feel the warmth radiating from her. "It was more than enough," he whispered. He reached out and gently touched her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. "Isabella," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I am not Marco Bellini, and I am not my grandfather. I am not going to make the same mistake." She looked up at him, her heart pounding, a million unspoken questions in her eyes. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Their lips met, and it was a revelation. It wasn't the angry, possessive energy of the dance floor. It was something else entirely. It was a kiss of profound recognition, a quiet, desperate acknowledgement of two lonely souls finally finding their counterpart. It was a story being told in a language that needed no translation. The kiss was broken by the sound of a door opening down the hall. They sprang apart like guilty teenagers. An elderly couple walked out of their suite, giving them a knowing smile as they passed. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside," Isabella whispered, her cheeks flushed. He nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. She unlocked her door and led him into her suite. The room was filled with books, maps, and scattered notes. Her life, her passion, was everywhere. He felt like he had stepped into the inner sanctum of her mind. The conversation that followed lasted until the sun began to rise over the ancient rooftops of Rome. They talked about everything and nothing, about his fear of not living up to his family's legacy and his deeper fear of becoming just like them. about her love for history and her struggle to build a life that was both intellectually fulfilling and financially stable. They were two people from different worlds, a man who had too much history and a woman who cherished it, a man who dealt in futures and a woman who found meaning in the past. They should have been opposites. But as they talked, they discovered they were just two different sides of the same coin, both searching for something authentic in a world of artifice. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky, Julian stood to leave. He paused at the door. "This changes things," he said. "I know," she replied. "This is no longer a fake engagement." "I know that too. So what is it?" he asked, his heart in his throat. She smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that lit up her entire face. "I don't know," she said, "but for the first time, I can't wait to find out." The shift was palpable. When they returned to New York, their public appearances as an engaged couple were no longer a performance. The stolen glances were real. The easy laughter was genuine. The way he would instinctively reach for her hand was not for the cameras, but for himself. Beatrice was ecstatic. "I knew it," she declared over lunch. "My matchmaking skills remain unparalleled. I should have been a Medici." But their newfound happiness was a direct threat to Marco Bellini. He had not taken his public defeat at the gala well. When he heard that the fake engagement was becoming very real, his wounded pride festered into something uglier. He saw Julian not just as a rival, but as the man who had succeeded where he had failed, the man who had won the woman he had been too weak to fight for. He decided that if he couldn't have Isabella, no one could. He would destroy her, and he would use the one thing he knew she valued most to do it: her reputation. He began a quiet, insidious campaign. He used his family's connections in the academic and art worlds to spread rumors. He'd mentioned to a museum curator over dinner, "It's such a shame about Isabella Rossi. A brilliant mind, but I heard she plagiarized her thesis at the Sorbonne." He'd casually tell a gallery owner, "Be careful with her. I've heard she deals in forged antiquities. She has a good eye, but her ethics are questionable." The rumors were baseless, but they were poisonous. They were whispers in the corridors of power, the kind of slander that could destroy a scholar's career. Isabella began to feel the effects. A lecture she was scheduled to give at Columbia was suddenly postponed. A consulting project with a major museum was mysteriously put on hold. She didn't understand why. She was working harder than ever. Her small tour company was thriving, and her partnership with Julian's foundation was making a real impact. She didn't tell Julian about the setbacks. She was too proud. She was determined to fight her own battles. The situation came to a head when her application to have her historical society officially recognized as a non-profit was denied by the state board. The reason given was vague: concerns regarding the founder's academic integrity. That night, Julian found her in the library of his mansion, which had now become her second home. She was sitting in the dark. A rejection letter crumpled in her hand, the fire in her eyes finally extinguished, replaced by a look of profound, weary defeat. "It's happening again," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's doing it again. He's erasing me." Julian took the letter from her hand and read it. A cold, hard anger, the likes of which he had never felt before, settled in his chest. This wasn't a business rivalry. This was a soul-destroying attack on the woman he loved. "No," he said, his voice a low growl. "He's not this time." He pulled her to her feet. "The first lesson you ever taught me was about history, about how empires fall." He looked at her, his eyes blazing. "It's time to teach Marco Bellini a little lesson about the decline and fall of his own." Julian Davenport in attack mode was a terrifyingly efficient sight. For years he had channeled his formidable intellect and vast resources into corporate acquisitions, dismantling companies with the surgical precision of a master strategist. Now, for the first time, he was directing that entire arsenal not at a balance sheet, but at a man who had dared to hurt the woman he loved. And it was not a cold, calculated campaign. It was personal. The first thing he did was call his head of security, a former MI6 agent named Thompson, who was loyal, discreet, and possessed a particular talent for unearthing secrets. "I want everything on Marco Bellini," Julian said, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "I don't want his corporate file. I want his life, his real life. I want to know where he invests his money, who he has dinner with, What skeletons are rattling in his very expensive closets? I want to know who he paid, who he threatened, and who whispered in his ear to start this campaign against Isabella. I want a map of his entire network of influence, and I want it in 48 hours. While Thompson and his team went to work, Julian focused on Isabella. He found her the next morning in the library, staring at the rejection letter from the state board, her face a mask of weary resignation. "It's over before it even began," she said, her voice hollow. "My historical society, my dream, he's poisoned the well. No one will fund me now. No one will trust me." Julian knelt in front of her, taking the crumpled letter from her hands and smoothing it out on the table. "This is not a verdict, Isabella," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "This is a declaration of war, and he has severely underestimated who he is fighting." "What can we do?" she asked, a flicker of her old fire returning. "He's attacking my reputation. It's my word against his, and his family has been part of that world for centuries." "Then we don't fight with words," Julian said, a strategic glint in his eye. "We fight with truth, your truth." He took her hands. "He is trying to erase your story. So we are going to tell it, louder and more beautifully than he could ever have imagined." His plan was audacious and pure Julian Davenport in its scale and precision. He wasn't just going to clear her name, he was going to build her a fortress so strong that no rumor could ever touch it again. He started by calling Beatrice. "Mother," he said, "I need your help. We are going to host an event, not a gala, not a ball, an evening of history, and it's going to be the most exclusive, most talked about event in New York this season." Beatrice, who had been listening with quiet fury to the rumors about Isabella, was delighted. "Darling," she purred, "leave it to me. By the time I'm done, the only story anyone will be talking about is the brilliance of my future daughter-in-law." For the next 2 weeks, the Davenport machine went into overdrive. Beatrice, with her unparalleled social power, curated a guest list that was a veritable who's who of the academic, artistic, and philanthropic worlds. She invited Pulitzer Prize-winning historians, the heads of the city's most prestigious museums, influential art critics, and a select few old-money patrons of the arts who valued intellectual pedigree above all else. Meanwhile, Julian and Isabella worked side by side, day and night, preparing. He turned an entire wing of his mansion into a temporary exhibition space. She, in turn, curated the exhibition of a lifetime. It wasn't just about her own work. She used her deep knowledge and her passionate eye to gather a collection of lost stories, forgotten female artists, overlooked historical documents, and artifacts that told the hidden narratives of the city. Her struggling historical society was about to get the most magnificent debut imaginable. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a single, powerful display. In a quiet, dramatically lit room was her grandfather's ruined, mud-stained copy of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, displayed under glass like a sacred relic. And next to it, on a simple pedestal, was a brand-new, beautifully bound first-edition copy. The inscription on the display read, "A story is only lost if we stop telling it." As they worked, something profound shifted between them. They were no longer just a couple in love, they were partners in every sense of the word. He was in awe of her brilliant, creative mind. She was stunned by his fierce, unwavering loyalty and the meticulous power of his support. He wasn't just funding her dream, he was co-building it, every step of the way. "You're not afraid," she said to him one night, as they were hanging a painting together. "Afraid of what?" he asked. "That this will backfire, that people will side with him, that this will damage your own reputation." He stopped what he was doing and turned to face her. "Isabella," he said, his voice full of a certainty that was absolute. "The only thing I am afraid of is a world where a voice like yours can be silenced. I will not let that happen." The night of the evening of Lost Stories arrived. The mansion was transformed. It was not a party. It was a salon, a gathering of minds. The atmosphere was one of quiet, intellectual excitement. Marco Bellini was there. Beatrice had, with a touch of Machiavellian genius, invited him personally, knowing he would be unable to resist the chance to see what he thought would be Isabella's final public humiliation. He walked in with a confident smirk, expecting to find a desperate last-ditch attempt at salvaging a ruined reputation. What he found was a room full of the most respected intellectual figures on the East Coast, all of them captivated by the exhibition Isabella had curated. He watched as Isabella, looking radiant in a simple, elegant black dress, moved through the room, not as a hostess, but as a respected scholar. She spoke with a quiet, passionate authority, sharing the stories behind each piece. He saw the head of the Metropolitan Museum of Art listening to her, enthralled. He saw a famously cynical art critic nodding in agreement with her analysis. His smirk began to falter. The main event of the evening was a short lecture by Isabella. She stood in front of a small podium, a single spotlight on her. Julian and Beatrice stood at the side, watching with proud, unwavering support. She didn't talk about the rumors. She didn't defend herself. She just told a story. She told the story of her grandfather, the historian who taught her to love the past. She told the story of the unsung female artists on the walls around them. She spoke of the importance of preserving the small, quiet narratives that are so often drowned out by the grand, loud histories of powerful men. A reputation, she concluded, her voice clear and strong, is a fragile thing, easily damaged by whispers and lies. But the truth has a different kind of strength. It is quiet, it is patient, and in the end, it always finds a way to be heard. The room erupted in a standing ovation. It was not the polite applause of a charity gala. It was a roar of genuine, heartfelt admiration. Marco Bellini stood frozen in the crowd, the blood draining from his face. He had tried to erase her, but instead, he had just given her the biggest stage of her life. After her speech, a line formed to speak with her. The museum curators wanted to collaborate. The historians wanted to co-author papers. The patrons of the arts wanted to know how they could fund her historical society. In one evening, she had not just cleared her name, she had become one of the most exciting new intellectual voices in the city. Julian watched it all, his heart so full he thought it might burst. Later, as the guests began to depart, Thompson, his head of security, approached him with a discreet nod. "We have it, sir," he whispered. "The final piece." Julian excused himself and followed Thompson to the study. On the laptop screen was a series of emails. It was the full correspondence between Marco Bellini and the state board member who had denied Isabella's nonprofit application. The emails were damning, a clear trail of collusion and slander. Thompson had also uncovered Marco's own academic secret. A significant portion of his own celebrated dissertation on Renaissance art had, in fact, been plagiarized from the work of a lesser-known deceased scholar. "He built his career on a stolen story," Julian murmured, a cold, hard anger returning, "and he tried to destroy hers to protect his own lie." He now had the weapon to destroy Marco completely. He could leak the emails, expose the plagiarism, and ruin him in the very academic world he held so dear. The old Julian, the ruthless CEO, would have done it without a second thought. It would be a checkmate. But as he looked at the screen, he thought of Isabella's words. "The truth is quiet, it is patient, and in the end it always finds a way to be heard." He closed the laptop. "Thank you, Thompson," he said. "Hold on to this. We're not going to use it. Not yet." He found Isabella in the now empty exhibition hall, standing in front of her grandfather's ruined book. "You were magnificent tonight," he said, coming to stand beside her. "We were," she corrected, slipping her arm through his. "We make a good team." "The best," he agreed. He hesitated for a moment, then said, "I have the proof, everything, the emails to the state board, proof that he plagiarized his own dissertation. I can ruin him, Isabella." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the display. "No," she said finally, "but he deserves it. He tried to destroy you." "And if we destroy him back," she said, turning to look at him, "then what's the difference between us and him? We told the truth tonight, Julian, our truth, that's enough. Let him live with the consequences of his own empty victory." He looked at her, at the profound, quiet strength in her eyes, and he felt a wave of love and admiration so powerful it left him breathless. She wasn't just his partner. She was his conscience. She was his better half. "You know," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "my mother was right." "About what?" "You are going to be a terrible influence on the cutthroat world of corporate acquisitions." "I certainly hope so," she said, her own smile matching his. He pulled her into his arms, right there in the middle of the room, filled with the stories she had saved. "I love you, Isabella Rossi," he whispered. "I love you too, Julian Davenport," she replied. Their kiss was not a victory kiss. It was a kiss of peace, a kiss that acknowledged the battles they had fought and celebrated the quiet, beautiful world they were now building together. A world where dignity was the most valuable asset, and truth was the only currency that mattered. The evening of Lost Stories was more than a social victory. It was a seismic shift in the cultural landscape of New York's elite. Isabella Rossi was no longer the mysterious tour guide on Julian Davenport's arm. She was a force in her own right, a respected scholar and a celebrated curator. The Isabella Rossi Historical Society, once a dream scribbled in a notebook, was now a fully funded and highly prestigious institution, with a waiting list of patrons eager to be associated with her name. Marco Bellini, in contrast, seemed to fade. The whispers about his academic dishonesty, though never publicly confirmed by Julian, began to circulate in the hushed, unforgiving circles of the art world. His reputation, once pristine, now had a permanent stain. He quietly retreated from the New York social scene, a silent casualty of a war he had started but could not win. For Julian and Isabella, life settled into a new, beautiful rhythm. They became an inseparable team, their lives and passions intertwining in a way that felt both natural and miraculous. The Davenport mansion, once a cold monument to Julian's isolation, was transformed. The library became Isabella's second home, its walls now lined not just with financial texts, but with rare historical manuscripts and first-edition novels she would find on her story-hunting expeditions. The quiet, sterile rooms were now often filled with the sounds of lively debates as they hosted dinners for a mix of historians, artists, tech moguls, and venture capitalists. Julian, to his own astonishment, loved it. He found that discussing 17th-century naval maps with a quirky professor was infinitely more interesting than discussing stock options with a hedge fund manager. Isabella had not just entered his world, she had expanded it, filling it with color, curiosity, and a depth he had never known. Their partnership extended to their professional lives. Julian, inspired by Isabella's vision, created a new philanthropic arm of Davenport Holdings, dedicated to preserving historical sites and funding under-resourced museums. Isabella, in turn, with her sharp, analytical mind, became his most trusted, albeit unofficial, business advisor. She had an uncanny ability to see the human story behind a corporate merger, to predict how a new technology would impact a community. She didn't read balance sheets, she read people, and her insights were more valuable than any market analysis. "You've ruined me for normal business meetings," he told her one evening, as they were looking over a proposal for a new tech acquisition. "How so?" she asked, not looking up from the document. "I spent the entire meeting today not thinking about the ROI, but trying to figure out the CEO's foundational myth," he said with a wry smile. "I've concluded he has serious, unresolved issues with his father, which is why he's so obsessed with acquiring smaller, family-owned companies. It's not business, it's a Freudian drama." She finally looked up, her eyes sparkling with laughter. "And are we going to acquire the company?" "No," he said. "I'm sending him the number of a good therapist instead. It's a much better long-term investment." They were happy. It was a quiet, solid happiness, built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared passions, and a deep, unwavering love. The final piece of their past that needed to be addressed was Beatrice. After her triumphant orchestration of their fake engagement, she had wisely stepped back, giving them space to find their own way. But now, with their relationship a solid, public fact, she was ready to make her next move. She invited them to Sunday brunch at her country estate. It was a beautiful, sprawling property, with gardens that were even more magnificent than the ones at Julian's mansion. "Darlings," she said, greeting them with her signature air kisses. "You both look radiant. Love suits you." The brunch was a pleasant, relaxed affair. They talked about the foundation, about Isabella's latest historical discoveries, about Julian's new, more human-centric approach to business. It was all very civilized, until Beatrice, with a casualness that was utterly calculated, dropped her bombshell. "So," she said as she poured them more tea, "have you set a date?" Julian and Isabella exchanged a quick, slightly panicked look. "A date for what, Mother?" Julian asked, though he knew perfectly well what she meant. "For the wedding, of course," Beatrice said, her eyebrows raised in feigned surprise. "You are getting married, aren't you? The entire city is expecting it." I've already had preliminary sketches for the invitations made up. Something classic with a Roman motif, I think. Mother, Julian started, we haven't. We're happy with how things are right now, Beatrice, Isabella interjected smoothly, saving him. We're focusing on our work, on building our foundations. Nonsense, Beatrice said with a wave of her hand. Love and work are not mutually exclusive. In fact, a good marriage is the most strategic partnership one can have. It solidifies the brand. She looked at them, her expression turning serious for the first time. I am not just talking about appearances. I have watched you two. You make each other better. You challenge each other. You are a team. That is the definition of a good marriage. It's time to make it official. On the drive back to the city, the car was filled with a new, unspoken tension. She's not wrong, you know, Julian said quietly, breaking the silence. Isabella looked out the window. About what? The Roman-themed invitations? No, he said, reaching across and taking her hand. About us. About being a team. He turned to look at her, his expression earnest. I know this all started as a bizarre contractual arrangement orchestrated by my mother, but it's become the most real thing in my life. I love you, Isabella, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to build a real legacy, a real family. Isabella's heart swelled. I love you too, Julian, she whispered. More than I ever thought I could love anyone. So, he said, his voice a little shaky. What do you say? Should we give my mother what she wants and get married? She turned in her seat to face him, a slow, mischievous smile spreading across her face. A Davenport and a Rossi, she said. It does have a certain historical ring to it, but if we're going to do this, we're doing it our way. No grand galas, no stuffy cathedrals. What do you have in mind? He asked, intrigued. I'm thinking, she said, her eyes sparkling, a small private ceremony. In Rome, in front of the Colosseum, right where I first yelled at you. He laughed, a deep, joyful sound. It's perfect, he said. Absolutely, perfectly us. Their wedding was a secret they shared with only a handful of people. They flew to Rome with Beatrice and Isabella's small, found family of fellow historians. They were married at dawn, in the quiet, empty plaza in front of the Colosseum, the ancient stones their only witnesses. Isabella wore a simple, elegant white dress. Julian wore a beautifully tailored linen suit. They didn't have music or flowers or a crowd of guests. They just had each other, and the weight of 2,000 years of history bearing witness to their vows. They promised not a lifetime of perfect happiness, but a lifetime of shared stories, of mutual support, of facing the world as an unbreakable team. They promised to always see the humanity behind the facade, to always listen to the quiet truths, and to always, always choose each other. After the ceremony, they didn't have a lavish reception. They had breakfast at a small, family-owned cafe, the kind of place Isabella loved, where the owner greeted them with a booming auguri and a plate of warm cornetti on the house. They spent their honeymoon not in a five-star resort, but exploring the hidden corners of Italy, hunting for lost stories in dusty church archives and small, forgotten museums. It was a perfect beginning to a life that promised to be a grand, beautiful, and endlessly interesting adventure. When they returned to New York, they didn't just merge their lives, they merged their homes. They sold Julian's cold, minimalist penthouse and Beatrice's grand formal estate. Together, they bought a historic brownstone in Greenwich Village, a house with good bones, a slightly overgrown garden, and enough rooms for a growing family and a very large library. They spent the next year renovating it, filling it with books, with art, with laughter, and with love. The Isabella Rossi Historical Society found its permanent home on the ground floor, a beautiful, sunlit space that was open to the public. Davenport Holdings, under Julian's new, more compassionate leadership, continued to thrive. But his real passion and his greatest investment was now the foundation he and Isabella ran together. A foundation dedicated to ensuring that no story and no person was ever forgotten. One crisp autumn afternoon, about 2 years after their Roman wedding, Julian walked into the library of their brownstone. Isabella was curled up in a large armchair by the fireplace, a book in her lap, a soft, contented smile on her face. "What are you reading?" he asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her. "Just an old story," she said, leaning her head back against his chest. about an arrogant Roman emperor and a fiery historian who taught him a thing or two about humility. "Sounds familiar," he murmured, kissing the top of her head. "How does it end?" She closed the book and turned in his arms to face him, her eyes shining with a love that was as deep and as timeless as the stories she cherished. "It doesn't," she said softly. "That's the beautiful part. With them, it's just a series of new, wonderful beginnings." He smiled, knowing exactly what she meant. Their life was not a closed book, a finished history. It was a living, breathing narrative, a story they were writing together, day by day, a story of two different worlds colliding to create a new one. A world built not on power or prestige, but on the enduring, transformative power of a shared story and a love that was, in the end, the greatest discovery of all. Life in the Greenwich Village brownstone was a beautiful, organized chaos that neither Julian nor Isabella would have traded for anything. The house, once a silent, historic shell, was now a vibrant hub of activity, a perfect fusion of their two worlds. The ground floor, home to the Isabella Rossi Historical Society, was a public space, filled with the quiet rustle of turning pages and the excited whispers of students and researchers. The upper floors were their private sanctuary, a warm, inviting space filled with books, art, mismatched furniture they had found on their adventures, and the ever-present, judgmental gaze of Beatrice's surprisingly pampered cat, who had decided to adopt them. Beatrice herself had become a regular fixture in their lives. Having orchestrated their union, she now seemed determined to orchestrate their social life, their interior design choices, and, if given the chance, probably their stock portfolio. She would arrive unannounced, bearing ridiculously expensive cheeses and unsolicited advice. "Darling, this armchair is comfortable. I'll grant you that," she said one afternoon, eyeing a slightly lumpy but beloved chair Isabella had found at a flea market. "But it has the aesthetic appeal of a depressed potato. We simply must do something about it." "Beatrice," Isabella would reply, not looking up from a 17th-century manuscript she was examining, "that chair has witnessed more history than most of your friends. It's staying." Julian, once terrified of his mother's iron will, now found these exchanges endlessly amusing. He would sit back and watch the two formidable women in his life engage in a battle of wits, a loving, high-stakes game of chess where the prize was usually something trivial, like the placement of a lamp or the choice of curtains. Isabella, he noted with a deep sense of pride, almost always won. She didn't argue with Beatrice. She simply outmaneuvered her with a combination of historical precedent and unshakable charm. "You've met your match, Mother," Julian said to her one day, after Beatrice had been gracefully convinced that a modern, minimalist sofa was historically incongruous with the spirit of the brownstone. "Nonsense," Beatrice had replied, though her eyes were twinkling. "I'm simply cultivating a worthy successor." Their professional lives flourished in this new atmosphere of partnership. The Davenport Holdings Foundation, with Julian's strategic mind and Isabella's compassionate vision, became a powerhouse in the philanthropic world. They didn't just write checks, they got involved. They launched a program to restore and digitize the archives of small, underfunded historical societies across the country. They created scholarships for students from non-traditional backgrounds who wanted to study history and the arts. Julian, in turn, transformed his company. He promoted a new generation of leaders, men and women who, like Isabella, valued people over profit and collaboration over conquest. He became a mentor, a teacher, a leader who was respected not for his ruthlessness, but for his integrity. He discovered that a company with a soul was not just a happier place to work. It was a more successful one. They were a team in every sense of the word. He would help her decipher the complex financial documents of a nonprofit they were considering funding. She would help him write speeches that could move a room of jaded investors to tears. They were the perfect blend of head and heart, of logic and story. About a year after their wedding, Isabella was in the archives of their in-home historical society, carefully restoring a collection of letters from a forgotten female poet, when Julian walked in. He was holding 2 glasses and a bottle of their favorite champagne. "What's the occasion?" she asked, looking up from her work, a smudge of archival dust on her cheek. "I have some news," he said, his expression a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He poured the champagne and handed her a glass. "I just got off the phone with the board of trustees from the Sorbonne." Isabella's heart skipped a beat. "In Paris?" "The one and only," he confirmed. "It seems they've been following the work of the Rossi Society. They've been impressed." He took a deep breath. "They're offering you an honorary doctorate and a permanent position as a visiting professor." Isabella sank into a nearby chair, the champagne glass trembling in her hand. A professorship at the Sorbonne? It was the dream she had been forced to abandon all those years ago, the life she thought had been lost to her forever. "But my work is here," she stammered. "The society, the foundation." "And you can run it from anywhere," he said, kneeling in front of her. "We can live in Paris for a few months out of the year. We can build a life on both continents. We can do whatever we want. The only thing that matters is that we do it together." He took her hand. "He tried to destroy your academic career, Isabella. He tried to tell the world you weren't worthy. This is the final victory. This is you, reclaiming your story on your own terms." Tears of joy streamed down her face. It wasn't just a job offer, it was a validation, a closing of a circle that had been left painfully open for too long. "And what about you?" she asked. "Your company, your life is in New York." "My life," he said, his voice full of a deep, unwavering love, "is wherever you are. Davenport Holdings has a Paris office. I think it's time I started using it more often." She laughed through her tears, throwing her arms around his neck. "Paris," she whispered. "It seems my life has a certain poetic justice to it." "It's the best kind of story," he said, kissing her. Their life became a beautiful, transatlantic adventure. They spent their autumns and winters in New York, running their foundations and enjoying the cozy chaos of their Greenwich Village home. And they spent their springs and summers in a charming, sun-drenched apartment in Paris, where Isabella taught with a passion that made her one of the most beloved professors at the Sorbonne. And Julien discovered the joys of long lunches, afternoon walks along the Seine, and a life that was not dictated by the ringing of a stock market bell. It was during one of those golden Parisian afternoons that the next and most wonderful chapter of their story began. They were sitting in a small cafe, the same one where Isabella's ex-boyfriend had tried to win her back, a place they had reclaimed as their own. Isabella had been unusually quiet all morning, a thoughtful secret smile playing on her lips. "All right," Julien said finally. "What is it? You have the look of someone who's just discovered a long-lost manuscript." She smiled and reached into her bag. She didn't pull out a dusty old book. She pulled out a tiny pair of hand-knitted baby shoes. "I found these in a little shop this morning," she said, placing them on the table between them. I thought it was time we started a new collection. A very, very small one." Julien stared at the tiny shoes, his mind struggling to process the implication. Then, he looked at her, at the radiant, joyful, love-filled expression on her face, and a wave of happiness so pure and so powerful washed over him that it left him breathless. "Are you?" he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. She nodded, her own eyes shining with tears. "Yes," she said, "we are." He got up from his chair, walked around the small table, and pulled her into his arms, right there in the middle of the crowded Parisian café. He didn't care who was watching. He held her tight, his heart overflowing with a love bigger than any empire, a future brighter than any he could have ever predicted. They were no longer just Julien and Isabella, the CEO and the historian. They were about to become a family. And they knew, with a certainty that was as deep and as timeless as the city around them, that this was the most important and most beautiful story they would ever tell. The news of a baby on the way sent a joyful shockwave through their carefully curated transatlantic life. The pregnancy was, as Isabella cheerfully declared, their most exciting joint research project to date. Julien, a man who had once managed billion-dollar acquisitions with detached calm, now found himself utterly flummoxed by the complexities of choosing a stroller. "This one has an all-terrain suspension system and a 5-point safety harness," he'd announce, studying a brochure with the intensity he once reserved for stock market analysis. "Darling," Isabella would reply, not looking up from the massive copy of What to Expect When You're Expecting she was reading. "It's a baby, not a Formula One race car. It just needs to be comfortable and have a place to put my coffee." He was, to his own surprise, a doting and wonderfully anxious, expectant father. He read every book, attended every doctor's appointment, and would often be found in the half-finished nursery, trying to assemble a crib with a set of instructions that seemed to be written in a language even Isabella couldn't translate. "I think this part is supposed to be a leg," he'd mutter, holding up a piece of wood that looked suspiciously like a shelf. "Or a very small, very impractical catapult," Isabella would suggest, leaning in the doorway, her laughter filling the room. Their two homes, in New York and Paris, were gradually transformed into nests filled with tiny clothes, soft blankets, and an overwhelming sense of joyful anticipation. Beatrice, upon hearing the news, had reacted with her signature, understated drama. She had gone completely silent on the phone for a full 10 seconds, a silence so profound Julian had thought the line was dead. Then she had simply said, "Well, it's about time. I will start knitting immediately," and hung up. 2 days later, a truck arrived at their brownstone, delivering what appeared to be the entire inventory of a luxury baby boutique, along with a tiny, exquisitely hand-knitted cashmere sweater with the Davenport family crest embroidered on it. "I see your mother is approaching grandmotherhood with her usual subtlety," Isabella had commented, holding up a ridiculously small pair of designer baby shoes. But it was during Isabella's second trimester that the final, unresolved piece of their family puzzle finally came into focus. Julian's father, after the public humiliation of the evening of lost stories, had retreated into a self-imposed exile. He had not attended their wedding. He had not spoken to Julian in over 2 years. He was a silent, looming ghost in their otherwise happy lives. They were in New York at their brownstone when Beatrice arrived for dinner. She was carrying a single old, leather-bound book. "I was cleaning out some of Arthur's old things from the estate," she said, her voice unusually subdued. "And I found this. I think you two should see it." It was a journal, not a business ledger, but a personal diary, written in the familiar, spidery script of Julian's grandfather. But this was a journal from much later in his life, from the years after his wife had passed away. Julian and Isabella spent the evening reading it together, curled up on the sofa in their library. The journal told a story they had never known. It told of a lonely, regretful old man, a man who had fulfilled his duty but lost his joy. And it told of a final, quiet act of rebellion. In the last years of his life, Julian's grandfather had secretly reconnected with Clara, the violinist he had loved and left. They had not rekindled their romance. Instead, they had forged a deep, quiet friendship, a bond built on a lifetime of shared history and mutual respect. He had become a secret patron of her small music school, ensuring it had the funds to survive, and she, in turn, had brought music and warmth back into his silent, empty life. The final entry, written just a week before he died, was almost illegible, the handwriting shaky. "Clara came today. She played Mozart. For a moment the house was filled with light again. I told her I regretted nothing, but we both knew it was a lie. I have built an empire, but I have not built a life. I pray my grandson, Julian, is a wiser man than I." The name was correct, the sentiment clear. Julian closed the journal, his throat tight with emotion. He looked at Isabella, who had tears in her eyes. "He found his way back to her," he whispered. "In the end," she said softly, "he chose love too, in his own quiet way." "My father," Julian said, a dawning understanding in his voice. "He must have known. He must have found this journal after his father died. That's why he was so adamant about me not making the same mistake. He wasn't protecting the family's reputation. He was protecting me from his own father's regret." "Or he was protecting himself," Isabella countered gently. "If your grandfather could find a kind of happiness in the end, it meant that all the years of sacrifice, the entire foundation of your father's world, might have been based on a false premise." The next day, Julian did something he had sworn he would never do. He drove to the quiet, secluded estate where his father now lived in retirement. He didn't call first. He just showed up, the old journal in his hand. He found his father in the garden, a place he had rarely spent time in before, looking at a bed of wilting roses. "They were your mother's," Arthur said, not turning around. "I never knew how to care for them properly." "I know," Julian said, coming to stand beside him, "but it's never too late to learn." He held out the journal. "I think this belongs to you. but I read it first. Arthur looked at the journal, his face a mask of old familiar pain. He was a fool, he said, his voice rough. He let sentiment cloud his judgment. No, Julian said quietly. He was a man who made a hard choice and spent his life trying to find a way to live with it. Just like you. The two men stood in silence for a long time, the unspoken history of their family hanging between them. She's a good woman, your Isabella, Arthur said finally, his gaze still on the roses. She is strong, like your grandmother, and like Clara. It was the closest he would ever come to an apology and to a blessing. Yes, Julian said. She is. He took a deep breath. We're having a baby, father, a boy. For the first time, Arthur turned to look at his son. And for the first time, Julian saw not the ruthless CEO, not the demanding patriarch, but just a lonely old man. He saw a flicker of something in his father's eyes that he had never seen before. A deep, profound, and heartbreakingly human longing. A boy, Arthur whispered, the word full of a weight of a lifetime of missed connections. A grandson. He's going to need a grandfather, Julian said, a quiet offer of peace. One who can teach him about history, about the stories of our family, all of them. Arthur didn't reply, but as Julian turned to leave, his father's voice, rough with an emotion he had suppressed for decades, stopped him. Julian, he said, tell me, what does one do for a wilting rose? Julian smiled, a real, genuine smile of forgiveness. You start by giving it a little water, Dad, he said, and a lot of sunshine. The birth of Antonio Tony Rossi Davenport was a joyous, chaotic, and wonderfully international affair. He was born in Paris, in a hospital overlooking the Luxembourg Gardens, a baby with his father's intense blue eyes and his mother's wild, dark curls. Beatrice arrived from New York within hours, armed with an arsenal of designer baby clothes and a determination to be the most glamorous grandmother in the history of France. Isabella's found family of historians flew in from Rome, bringing with them ancient lullabies and tiny hand-carved wooden toys. But the most surprising visitor arrived on the third day. Arthur Davenport, looking nervous and out of place, stood in the doorway of the hospital room, holding a small, awkwardly wrapped gift. I hope I'm not intruding, he said. Julian looked at Isabella, who gave him a warm, encouraging smile. Not at all, father, Julian said. Come in, there's someone I'd like you to meet. Arthur walked slowly to the crib and looked down at his grandson. He was silent for a long time, his face a mixture of awe and a deep, profound sadness for all the years he had missed. He reached out a hesitant hand and gently touched the baby's tiny, perfect fingers. He has your grandfather's hands, Arthur whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He then looked at Julian, his eyes full of a lifetime of unspoken words. Don't make the same mistakes I did, son. I won't, Julian promised, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. He's going to know all of our stories, the good and the bad, and he's going to know he is loved. Unconditionally. The gift Arthur had brought was a simple, silver rattle. It was the same one his own father had given him when he was born. As the tiny baby gripped the old, familiar object, a quiet, fragile bridge was built across 3 generations of Davenport men. A bridge built not of money or power, but of a shared and finally acknowledged hope for the future. Life with little Tony was a masterpiece of beautiful, joyful chaos. The Greenwich Village brownstone, once a quiet sanctuary of academia and reformed capitalism, was now command central for a tiny, diaper-clad dictator with his father's commanding presence and his mother's fiery spirit. Julian, who had once managed a global empire with unflappable calm, now found himself completely outmaneuvered by a 6-month-old's strategic deployment of strained peas. He has your negotiation tactics, Julian would say, wiping sweet potato off his bespoke suit jacket. And he has your stubborn refusal to accept no for an answer, Isabella would reply, laughing as she deftly cleaned up the mess. Their days were a whirlwind of board meetings and playdates, of deadlines and diapers. They were a team, navigating the complexities of parenthood and their shared professional lives with a sense of humor and a deep, abiding respect for each other. The foundation they had built together, a partnership forged in the fires of public humiliation and private vulnerability, was more than strong enough to handle the beautiful storm of a new baby. The Isabella Rossi Historical Society, now housed on the ground floor, became Tony's first playground. He would sit in a playpen in the corner of her office, surrounded by ancient maps and fragile manuscripts, babbling happily as Isabella conducted meetings with visiting scholars. The academics, initially bemused, quickly grew accustomed to the sight of one of the world's leading historians pausing a discussion on the Medici family to check on a teething baby. It was, they agreed, a refreshingly human approach to academia. Julian, for his part, brought the same revolutionary spirit to his own world. He instituted a company-wide parental leave policy at Davenport Holdings that was the most generous in the industry. He built a state-of-the-art daycare facility at their headquarters. He became a fierce, vocal advocate for work-life balance, arguing in financial journals that a company's greatest asset wasn't its intellectual property, but the well-being of its families. The man who once saw emotion as a liability now saw it as the ultimate competitive advantage. Their two families, once separated by an ocean of class and culture, were now beautifully intertwined. Beatrice and Arthur, in a development that shocked everyone, had found a new, quiet kind of companionship in their shared role as grandparents. They would visit the brownstone on Sundays. Arthur, now softer and more patient, would sit on the floor and painstakingly build block towers for Tony to gleefully knock down. Beatrice, who had once only been interested in couture, now knitted a never-ending supply of tiny, impossibly soft cashmere booties, each one in a different, vibrant color. They were an unlikely, chaotic, and deeply loving family. When Tony was 2 years old, they took him to Rome for the first time. They stood as a family in front of the Colosseum, at the very spot where their story had begun. "This," Isabella said, lifting Tony up so he could see, "is where I first met your father. He was being a very arrogant barbarian, and I had to teach him a lesson." Tony giggled, not understanding the words, but sensing the love in his mother's voice. "And this," Julian said, wrapping his arms around both of them, "is where I first saw the woman who would change my entire world. She was fiery and brilliant, and she was holding a very muddy book." They took Tony to the Borghese Gallery, and this time, as Julian stood in front of the sculpture of Apollo and Daphne, he didn't just see craftsmanship. He saw the story. He saw the terror, the transformation, the beautiful, heartbreaking tragedy of it all. He turned to Isabella, his eyes full of an understanding that had taken him years to learn. "I feel it now," he whispered. "The story, I finally feel it." She smiled, her own eyes shining. "I knew you would," she said. "You just needed the right guide." Later that week, they held a small, private ceremony at a quiet, beautiful old church. They were there to christen their son, but it felt like something more. It felt like a renewal of their own vows, a celebration of the family they had built. Beatrice and Arthur were there, sitting side by side in the front pew. But there was another, unexpected guest. Marco Bellini. Isabella had invited him. It was a gesture of grace and forgiveness that Julian had initially struggled to understand. But after everything he did, Julian had started. "Everyone deserves a chance to rewrite their story," Isabella had replied simply. Marco looked older, humbled. After his public disgrace, he had left the art world and taken over his family's charitable foundation, dedicating his life to making amends. He approached them after the ceremony, his expression earnest. "Isabella," he said, "Julian, I don't have the words to express my regret. What I did was unforgivable. But I want you to know that seeing the life you have built, the good you are doing in the world, it has inspired me to become a better man." "That's all anyone can ask for, Marco," Isabella said, offering him a genuine, forgiving smile. Julian, seeing the sincerity in his old rival's eyes, extended his hand. "The past is the past," he said. "The future is what we build now." The two men shook hands, not as rivals, but as two people who had, in their own different ways, been transformed by the love of an extraordinary woman. Their life continued, a rich tapestry woven from threads of history, business, philanthropy, and family. They had another child, a daughter they named Clara, after Julian's grandfather's lost love, a quiet tribute to the power of a story that had finally found its happy ending. They grew older. Their children grew up, inheriting their mother's passion for stories and their father's strategic mind, tempered with a kindness that was all their own. The foundations they had built became their legacy, changing thousands of lives, ensuring that no story and no person was ever left in the shadows. One evening, many years later, Julian and Isabella, now with silver in their hair and the gentle wisdom of a life well lived in their eyes, were sitting on the porch of their country home. Their grandchildren were playing in the yard, their laughter echoing in the twilight. Julian was reading a thick, leather-bound book. "What is that?" Isabella asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. He showed her the cover. It was the first edition copy of Gibbon's Decline and Fall that he had bought for her all those years ago to replace the one he had ruined. "I never asked you," he said. "Did you ever finish reading it?" She smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that still made his heart skip a beat. "No," she said. "Why not?" "Because," she said, taking his hand, "I was too busy living a much better story." She looked out at her family, at the beautiful, chaotic, wonderful life they had built together. "Our story." He looked at her, at the woman who had stormed into his life in front of an ancient ruin and completely rebuilt his world. The tour guide who had become his guide in life. The love of his life. "And how do you think our story ends?" he asked. "It doesn't," she whispered, her eyes shining with a love that was as timeless as the history she so cherished. "That's the beautiful part. It just keeps going." He leaned in and kissed her. A soft, familiar kiss full of a lifetime of shared memories and the promise of countless more to come. Theirs was a story that had begun with a ruined book, but it had been rewritten into an epic. A tale of two different worlds colliding to create a new one. A world where the greatest legacy was not what you owned, but who you loved, and the stories you chose to tell together. What did you think of the story of Julian and Isabella? On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate their journey from the Colosseum to a lifetime of love? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And for everyone who has stayed with us until the very end, who believes that every story deserves a happy ending, please comment, "The story continues." We are so grateful to share these narratives with you. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will change your world.